Hi, everyone. My name is Siniša Milatović. I'm a business and human rights specialist working globally with UNDP. And it's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's Spotlight session. And I am privileged to be in conversation here with Vicky Bowman, who's the director of the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business. And we're going to talk about navigating remedy in conflict contexts. So this is in keeping with the theme of this year's forum and its focus on remedies. But let me first start, maybe, Vicky, you just said that you know of most people here, but for those that might not know you, if you can sort of introduce yourself and tell us how you got here, how you became involved in business and human rights in Myanmar.
Sure. So I began life studying science, pathology, and then went into the diplomatic service and served twice in Myanmar and also in Brussels for 6 years, where I was in Myanmar very much focused on human rights and to some extent on discouraging business from being there. And in Brussels, it was around the time that they were getting to grips with CSR, which is a word we now ban in our organisation, but it was the early days in sort of 1999 and so on. So very much pre-CS-DDD. And then from there, I was in the Foreign Office for a while, including as the director around economic issues and climate change, working on G8. And from there went to Rio Tinto at the time that the UN Guiding Principles had just been adopted in 2011. So part of my job was about rolling that out within the mining company globally. We obviously had human rights policies and so on, but we hadn't aligned them to the UNGPs. And then things started to change in Myanmar. My husband, who is Myanmar, wanted to go back. I wanted to go back. And that was when IHRB and the Danish Institute for Human Rights had both been talking separately about what can we do to put the UNGPs in place in Myanmar in this new opportunity. And they were both coming to me separately, and I said, you two should talk to one another and then you should hire me. So that's how I ended up in Myanmar in 2013, along with a number of other people here in the room, including, I don't know if Nin is here, but she was actually the first employee of MCRB, and then Thithi was number 3 after me. So it's great to have the old gang back together again.
Well, that's wonderful. Maybe you can tell us just a bit more about, I don't know if your pathologist training can help you in this, but what makes Myanmar a conflict or challenging context?
Yeah, I mean, this has been historically the case, both, I guess, even pre-colonial times, but certainly post-war, particularly around this huge variety of ethnic nationalities there, linguistic differences, religious differences, and this has played out both between different ethnic nationalities, but also between the majority nationality since the war, but particularly reflecting the fact that the military is such a dominant force. So for a long time we had the Burmese way to socialism, very little outside investment at all, and the world didn't pay any attention. And it was only really with the sort of arrival of Aung San Suu Kyi as a sort of known name on the scene that people started to pay attention back in 1988. Fast forward to 2012 and her release and sort of a change that came on the scene. And everyone thought everything is great. And so there was a huge sort of positive move of companies wanting to go in there, of the international community engaging. And no one was really paying attention to the fact that the fundamental issues around ethnic rights and so on had not been resolved through the constitution that the military had put in place and was still not being actually resolved under a new, more democratic system. So that underlying conflict has been there, overlain then by a military which has never really felt comfortable with democracy and has felt threatened by it, and hence, fast forward to 1st of February 2021 and waking up to find a note from my husband saying, darling, there's been a coup, I've gone to the tea shop, which is really the usual behaviour of most Burmese men. But, that very much changed the whole dynamic and left Generation Z, who had enjoyed this opening up, this blooming of digital technologies, having mobile phones, being connected to the world, and that looked as though that was under threat, as indeed it was. And since then, things have just deteriorated over time because of a wide-ranging conflict across the country, which has multiple levels, multiple causes.
So your husband treated the news with equanimity, you could say, but I imagine that your work changed pre and post coup, the work of the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business. Can you just give us some insights? And by the way, these reports that Vicky has in front of her, which make light evening reading
available
for those that are interested, they are sector impact assessments in Myanmar from before 2021, from before the coup. So can you give us a sort of a comparison? Because what the picture you paint is of a society that is riven by division or conflict to some extent even before the coup, and now especially, I imagine. So how have things changed before and after the coup?
Yeah, so thank you for referring to our major magnum opuses, and they really are, I'm sorry, they're magnum. This one is 262 pages long, but they are hugely valuable, and when I go back and look at them now, I see that they've been downloaded 10,000 times, which makes me very proud, and it wasn't just me doing that. But they were a systematic way to put the UN guiding principles, or rather to review the particular sector. So we did it for ICT, tourism, mining, oil and gas. Look at that sector through UNGP lens, particularly around first pillar, the legal framework and policy framework. Second pillar, what was happening on the ground, what businesses were doing to respect or not respect human rights. And thirdly, through remedy. Along a variety of different issues around indigenous peoples, gender, community consultation, and so on. And then come up with recommendations to different sets of stakeholders. And in doing that, we found that we were very much, therefore, in the midst of an emerging legal framework, which gave us a huge opportunity, particularly around things like investment law, the environmental impact assessment process, which was clearly key to trying to improve the extractive sector, but also some of the other sectors, tourism. So that was a hugely varied, multi-dimensional operation across 10 years, advocating to governments, working with development partners, working with the new parliamentarians, and working with businesses to try to align these emerging legal frameworks with the UNGPs. And I think we succeeded in some places. For example, I was just looking back that with the grievance topic, which we're talking about, we got Article or Principle 31 of the UNGPs written into the legal document that is given to all projects which get their environmental impact assessment approved. In other words, they all have to have a grievance mechanism that is compliant with the 8 principles around legitimacy and so on. So we've turned it from being voluntary into a legal requirement, and I don't think there are many countries in the world that have done that. Now, whether or not it's enforced in practice, and when you go to the Environment Ministry and they haven't really got a clue what it is that they've asked companies to do, that was what we were getting towards on 1st of February 2021. So I've forgotten already, Shanisha, what your question was, but it was to say that we were doing great work, and then unfortunately
so you stopped at the right moment, and that right moment was with the coup. So how did things change after that? You're talking about, you're painting a picture of essentially an environment in which it was getting slightly easier to do this kind of work. What changed?
So the first thing was we stopped talking to the authorities, because then the authorities that had taken charge were military-led. They were not legitimate. They'd overturned the results of the election. So obviously everything we were doing related to legislation and policy was out of scope. And it wasn't just our own choice, but this was a time when the entire population was not willing to engage with Naypyidaw, with the capital. And then we had companies facing a whole range of new issues that had not been a part of the pre-coup discourse. Amongst them were the whole question of paying tax, and whether or not that was in some way a form of complicity with the human rights abuses of the powers that be. And where there wasn't really, when I kind of Googled, tax and human rights abuses, what you tended to get showing up was the avoidance of paying tax being treated as a form of failure to respect human rights. So there weren't many answers to this, and there still aren't, frankly. I mean, it's a very politicized debate. But these were the kind of things that companies were coming to us and saying, well, what do you think? When our employees say to us, you should not pay tax, how should we respond? Generally, what companies did was just delay. This was a time of huge sort of emotion, And so they were respecting that amongst their workforce, while at the same time saying, we're only going to be able to delay so long before the bills start mounting up and the authorities are going to come to us and say, if you're not going to pay tax, you've got to leave, or we're going to seize your brewery license, or whatever. So those were the sort of ad hoc solutions that were being brought up every single day. Safety being a top human rights risk that people were suddenly facing. The risk of, as we saw with one particular Korean bank, that their commuter bus was shot at and one of their employees was killed simply because the driver had failed to stop at a checkpoint. So these were the day-to-day parts of a company's human rights due diligence. What we have found is a huge interest amongst companies in hearing what others are facing and how they are dealing with these solutions. So almost all of the Chambers of Commerce's members have gone up, particularly the European Chamber of Commerce, because it sort of flexed to a very strong focus on helping companies with their day-to-day human rights due diligence. And as a result, people were, yes, we want to be with others facing the same challenges and trying to find common solutions together, if there are common solutions. And in some cases, every context is different.
So when it comes to, the topic today is obviously, and the topic of the theme of the forum is remedy. You talk even in, you painted a picture which basically says that before the coup it was easier to do business in human rights work, and obviously was. But at the same time, you note quite a few challenges in these sort of sector impact assessments, in engaging stakeholders, in sort of establishing operating grievance mechanisms that function well, and so on. Can you talk about those, and can you talk about how that works now? I mean, from the perspective of the rights holder, how do you get remedy in, I don't want to say in all conflict contexts, because we're talking about Myanmar, but concretely in Myanmar, and what, can you draw from that to give sort of lessons for other conflict contexts? What is possible and what isn't?
Well, so to some extent, if you had your systems in place before the coup, you were able to operate them afterwards, because if you've got operational grievance mechanisms, if you're seeking to be responsive to your workers or to local communities, it is in your control as a company. And the coup doesn't change that, particularly if you've built up a good relationship. So what we had seen over the previous 10 years was a few examples of companies which had done this well. So for example, Telenor, who obviously they are everywhere, or they were everywhere because they're a telecoms provider, they had decided to put liaison officers in each state and region, who were usually people who spoke the local languages, and who were the first go-to point for people who were worried about, the radiation from the telephone mast, or the fact that their road had been dug up to lay a cable. So that gave them a network that survived post-coup, and was also a form of effectively intelligence on the ground around different risks that were coming up. Another example, which is a OGM that still operates, is one that was designed by Stacey. Is she here in the room? I don't know whether she's here, but MPRL, who are a Myanmar company running an onshore, fairly small oil block, had worked with the 12 villages in their area to have a volunteer in each one. Those volunteers are still there. There may be turnover, some may change, but again, that has given them a very strong link with their local communities, and as things have changed because of the coup, it's given them again a relationship with the communities around security, around their needs related to flooding and so on. So doing it before the shit hits the fan is obviously, always a good idea. Where there have been issues that have been caused by the coup, and which obviously, is the impact of the conflict on your human rights due diligence, so hence heightened human rights due diligence, have been things like the attitude of the authorities towards organisations, whether it be NGOs, whether it be trade unions. And so if you are let's say a garment factory which has had a trade union in the factory, then almost certainly those trade unions are going to feel under threat from local authorities, so they will be weaker. And then you either as a factory itself or as a brand are going to need to take that into account, and are you going to need to somehow strengthen how you hear worker voice, or pay more attention and more messaging, and this is what we've always been saying to brands, to factories, that unions are a good thing and should be encouraged and supported rather than bashed. Now, if you've got bad management, and there are factories in Myanmar who are very anti-union, they will potentially be taking advantage of that. And we saw that last year with the Hosheng factory, which was an Inditex supplier, where a union, against all odds, was trying to form according to the law, and the factory management decided it didn't want that kind of thing, so it called in its mates from the local security forces to intimidate those workers. So, you know, we've seen good examples of people who have been supporting local grievances, and then we've seen other employers who've taken advantage of, you know, the fact that people are desperate for jobs.
So it sounds like there is some room to at least be creative. You mentioned Telenor, you mentioned, you know, establishing sort of contact points and so on. Do you think, and this is just an impression from the outside, that, you know, sometimes companies use the, you know, situation, the overall situation, as a pretext not to do more? Essentially, that there's a room to do more, but it's not being done. You know, unless something is forbidden, you can do it essentially, or you can be creative. I mean, is there that kind of sort of race to the bottom, I don't want to call it, among some companies, by saying, okay, we'll just go with the lowest common denominator, we'll do the minimum, and, you know, we hope we're okay?
I think that thinking exists, but I don't think it was exacerbated by the coup. I think companies that thought like that, some of them may not be there anymore, because some of them may have decided that for commercial reasons. I mean, we've seen an awful lot of companies leaving for commercial reasons, and some of those were companies who never bothered to do anything, never showed up to any of our invitations, never took part in multi-stakeholder initiatives, and so on. So I don't think that the coup has actually worsened that. I think that would be a very kind of malign interpretation, but there are simply some companies for whom this was not in the culture before, and, you know, if anything, it perhaps has started to be more in the culture because they've understood they are in more sensitive circumstances. So I wouldn't say I've seen companies taking advantage of bad practices. On the other hand, within the garment industry, I think that there are issues around the fact that although we would like people to continue to source because it provides jobs, they have to be more decent jobs than the wider sector is delivering. And I honestly think that's a problem of the sector globally. It's not a Myanmar-specific problem, and it's a problem of multiple brands who don't pay enough attention to the conditions on the ground. We saw, and our advice has been, in this situation, you need a team on the ground, or you need somebody representing you on the ground, so that you can be following the day-to-day events. Some brands have done that. Some brands, even when I sort of track them down through their private equity owners and say, hello, I'm former British ambassador, I'm friendly to business, please could you get in contact with me? Absolute silence. That, for me, is a company that's taking advantage of the situation.
So you mentioned...
Name names? No.
Yes. But
I wouldn't go shopping at New Yorker. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Now we have your diplomat's mask slip a bit, so that's not a bad thing. You mentioned companies leaving. So for those that don't know, UNDP published a guide together with the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights 2 years ago on so-called heightened human rights due diligence, which is now being incorporated in the CS3D. And in it, we touch on the topic of so-called responsible exit and what are the processes you're supposed to undertake before you leave or not. I mean, in any case, in deciding whether to stay or go. And OHRDD has published a note last year on doing business in challenging contexts and exactly this sort of question. So, full sort of confession, I work more on the Ukraine, let's say, issue, with our colleagues in Ukraine than here. And there I sense the discussion around the conflict in Ukraine is almost exactly inverse, in that I sense that there are businesses in Russia who are trying to justify staying by saying they provide essential goods and so on. So the decision on whether to stay or leave, I mean, clearly it's commercially profitable. Whereas here you seem to hint at something, I mean, I'm not saying that all businesses have the same sort of calculus, but there might be some businesses who want to leave, but are not exactly leaving because of other considerations. So I'm just wondering how this sort of decision to stay or go is playing out, and also whether this idea that you're providing essential goods, whatever they might be, and we had companies in Russia who claimed they make chocolates and people cannot live without chocolate. So this idea of an essential good is very sort of loosely defined. Whether this has any purchase at all in companies' decision making, what is it that guides them in reality on the decision whether to stay or go?
So fundamentally, I think this plays out as a very political issue, particularly in Russia-Ukraine, and it is a completely different context because there you have two countries, and it's the Ukrainian lobby saying you shouldn't be in Russia. So that's not obviously the case around Myanmar, where you have one country and you have the people within that country generally not wanting to be abandoned. You have maybe some people outside, some exiles who are saying, if we raise the economy to the ashes, then somehow that's going to bring down the military. I don't buy that. I believe that by destroying the formal economy, all you will do is make life easier for the abusers, for the organised crime gangs. You will further send, talking to colleagues here about people who are now saying to themselves, there's nothing here for me now, I'm going to do a computer degree so I can go and work in a scam centre. That's not a great outcome for democracy and human rights. So I just do think that the two situations are very different. And although we have debates around essential services in Myanmar, as we had last week, we had massive floods, what that showed was the value of having a resilient telecoms network, the value of having a banking network that functions. So people dealing with that were not saying to themselves, I don't want to be using my phone provided by MPT or Atom because of, I want them to go. They were like, when is this thing going to be turned back on? And the companies were jumping to it and getting it switched back on. And also those companies at the same time were doing relief work and were actually far faster than any of the multilateral donors or bilateral donors from governments in getting money out there to people when they needed it. So, yeah, our take on essential services is nowhere near as theoretical as the work that you're doing. It's actually much more about keeping day-to-day life going in whatever means. And people are sort of not politicizing that, I would say.
So then, if the default position is that companies should stay, let's say,
I think the default position is that companies should assess whether leaving, they are creating more adverse impacts. Well, first of all, they should seek to minimise any adverse impacts of their operations while staying. But in considering whether or not to leave or not, they should be considering what are going to be the adverse impacts of that decision.
So I guess
on rights holders, not on their own reputation, because
right.
It's actually very easy to say, we're quitting, and you no longer have the people, demonstrating outside your headquarters in Stockholm. That is not helping anybody on the ground.
So is there a particular, I guess my question is going to be, is there a particular industry and so on where you think that sort of calculus is slightly different, where they are on the balance of, harms to rights holders and the impact on the conflict, because it is a conflict-affected sort of context, that companies should consider leaving? I'm not asking you to say, company X, Y, and Z should leave, but generally speaking, do we have a distinction to make between different sectors, different, companies that maybe come from different jurisdictions and have different practices, or anything else?
I think these things are very difficult, because although I could say, if you are a company that is potentially complicit in abuses by the military, you should leave, and I wouldn't disagree with myself on that, there's still going to be that question of whether somebody else is going to step into the breach. So an interesting example is Puma Energy, who quite early on after the coup did what they could to try to suspend deliveries of aviation fuel because they didn't feel confident that this was not going to be ending up being put in military jets. And they sort of formally exited. That hasn't stopped the jets from flying, but it has certainly, reduced their risk of complicity. So I guess if I was a Puma shareholder or a board member, I would be happy with that. But unfortunately, the problem still continues. And I feel more generally, we're still having this debate about aviation fuel. I feel that the last planes to be flying will be the military ones, because one way or another, even if aviation fuel is sanctioned, it will bring down civil aviation network. But crypto and other things will still manage to be available to the military to buy their stuff. So, but then that's not Puma Energy's problem anymore. So it's a tricky one. Then there's this wider question of, which came up in yesterday's discussion about PTTEP, and Ghislaine and Ben were talking about that. Where there is money to be made, somebody will step into the breach. And we had this a little bit with Telenor. And I mean, Telenor had a very complex problem because it was influenced by EU sanctions policy as well. And they did their best working with us, including through this, to address what they had seen as their main risk back in 2013, which was around surveillance. And at the point that the coup hit, they were in the process of still trying to mitigate that problem while continuing and dealing with the EU sanctions in a compliant manner. Afterwards, with the coup, they decided that was no longer going to be possible because their staff were at risk, the fact that they weren't going to be willing to turn on the surveillance equipment. So each of these, it's difficult to say, are we better off with Telenor staying with a sort of a sanctions exemption, or are we better off with their replacement company that never really engages on anything to do with responsible business?
So then is the question then, it sort of begs the question that maybe we've been looking at this all wrong. Maybe this whole idea of responsible exit is moot. Because, if ultimately what you just said was, you said if there's money to be made, somebody will step into the breach. And I can't imagine a world in which we never get to a company. There will always be somebody interested. If that's the case, is the discussion responsible exit, I don't say irrelevant, but is it not the right discussion to be having?
To me, it's a question which is entirely company-centric.
Right.
It really doesn't, at the end, benefit rights holders when company leaves. You might be able to come up with some example where it did, but generally it's about companies saying, this is no longer our problem. And we're not involved in Myanmar anymore, so Vicky, you can stop sending us emails.
Well, that's not a bad reason to leave either. Okay, I'm aware.
But I have a long memory.
We kind of got lost in the conversation. I wanted to leave a bit more time for audience questions, but I feel like we could go over time, 5 minutes at least. So let's turn it over to you. Vicky's here, which is a great opportunity for anyone to ask any questions about Myanmar or her work or any of the issues we discussed. So does anybody have any questions? I see a hand up over there. Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. That was very, very, it was a very learning session for me. And I would like to ask you, we also have a genocide happening in Gaza. And how would you, because there, if we want to talk about defense corporations, the defense corporations sell not to the people, but to states. And states, at least in this case, have not responded very, let's say, with responsibility. What would you suggest? How does one really campaign or make any kind of a impact on what is happening there and how to get food inside? You're talking about wants and needs. I don't think there can be anything more necessary than food and water. And that's very basic. I think everybody would agree on that. How do we do that? Is there, from a responsible business perspective, what is the answer? Thank you.
If I had the answer to Gaza, if any of us did, all I can do is recommend IHRB has got a very good blog by Mark Taylor and a Palestinian colleague around, I think he comes up with 20 different ways that companies need to address potential complicity risk and recommendations to them. But that sort of wider question around getting relief to the people of Gaza, I don't really think that's a responsible business question. That's a hugely intergovernmental political question, so I can't give you an answer to that one. But certainly that whole question around how businesses should engage or not in Israel and in the occupied territories, there's a really good piece on the IHRB website from about May.
And if I may jump in, there is an excellent article, which is an academic article, but actually contains a lot of good sort of useful pointers by an Italian academic whose surname I'm forgetting. She's Dr. Irene, and I'll look it up. I'll be happy to share it if we run into each other. and she discusses responsibilities of companies under international criminal law and international humanitarian law, including defense contractors, but not limited to, in the context of Gaza. So ultimately, I think the way to pressure companies when it comes, and especially defense contractors, because their sort of link with the conflict couldn't be any clearer, is that there's actually a legal regime. You know, here we mostly talk about the UNGPs and so on, and UNGPs are not binding. I mean, we all know what they are. But there is a legal regime which is binding and which threatens individual criminal liability as well as corporate criminal liability that does apply. And I think that sort of creative advocates should make use of that. So I'll be happy to sort of discuss that outside a bit more if need be. Okay, anybody else?
Can I just say, while you're thinking of the questions, this approach I do think is replicable almost anywhere, but certainly in other, quote, challenging contexts. And one thing, you know, we're within MCRB now, we're sort of winding down. We closed our office formally at the beginning of last year after I was released from jail, and then we have sort of ended our funding. But our website stays up, everything we did stays up, and I'm more than happy to be contacted about, you know, how we can have a Mozambique Centre for Responsible Business or a Cambodian Centre for Responsible Business. In the early days, we used to be visited by NGOs from Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia who were hugely envious of what we were doing. I had a long conversation with Transparency International in Cambodia about whether or not it could be replicable there. I still think there are, you know, the potential to do it in other countries, and I think it really will help with the implementation of things like the EU CSDDD regulation, where I worry, or directive rather, where I worry that we're going to end up with just a barrage of consultation requests for local stakeholders on the ground to tick the boxes of the Volkswagens and so on of this world. And a much more efficient way, which was what we were trying to achieve there, of having an ongoing discussion that brought together a range of rights holder organisations and a range of companies, and didn't have to be repeated one-on-one with the intermediary of PwC and people like that. Sorry, no offence to PwC, but you know, that's not what a effective dialogue is going to be made up of, questionnaires and consultancies. It's about an ongoing dialogue around different sectors and risks.
Okay, we've gone slightly over time, but I see we have two questions. So I'll ask them. No, we have four questions. I'll ask to make them very quick until they kick us out of the room. Let's keep going. So, go ahead.
Thank you. My name's Catherine. I'm coming from Aotearoa, coloniser name New Zealand. War is a racket. It's a business, right? It's an industrial complex. But there are businesses who want certainty. We know businesses need certainty to operate, and they want certainty. War creates uncertainty. So do you think, in the realm of possibility, there is a chance for business and industry who want certainty can, you know, mobilise to make a call? I'm thinking about the UN Security Council that's dysfunctional. They can't even create peace at the moment. Maybe the businesses who do want peace and security can campaign as a bloc and go against the businesses who profit from war as a bloc. What do you think?
Again, I bring it down to my narrow parochial experience, and one reason why I left diplomacy was because I didn't want to be, you know, sort of representing talk shops in New York. After the coup, we facilitated a collective statement by companies, and we never, by the way, worked with the defence sector at all, partly because there's a very existing and long-standing sanctions regime around anything to do with defence sales to Myanmar, at least from EU, US, and so on. But with the Coca-Colas and Telenors and Unilevers and so on of this world, plus a lot of local companies, plus ultimately quite a few Japanese companies, to say basically what has happened on the 1st of February is bad for the country, it's bad for business, it's bad for the people. And we want to have restoration of rule of law, stability, democracy, human rights. So at that level, and we weren't dealing with the kind of things you're talking about, but it was to give the message from business that this coup was a bad thing for everybody. And you know, the sooner we got back to the situation prior to the 1st of February, the better.
Thanks, Vicky. There was a question in the back, I think. Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to build on your point on the sort of responsible exit not being, like maybe being an illusion. Because a lot of public campaigns, and I think maybe many passionate people around the world that want to support Myanmar, there's the whole campaigns around boycotts and so on of big corporations is an essential element to that. So what would you tell people that, you know, might have boycotted things around, like around apartheid in South Africa? The boycotts was a big part of the public campaign. So what would you recommend in that sense for Myanmar? So
for Myanmar, I don't think that the military is going to, you know, wrap up its whatever one military, you know, or shield its guns because Coca-Cola and Unilever leave. And so I think that the sort of concept, the idea that if you lay waste to the economy, that the military will go, oh gosh. I mean, actually, the military itself, through its policies, are laying more waste to the economy than anybody, and they seem to think that's a good idea. So, you know, I don't think it will work. And secondly, if you're trying to look for a way out of this, providing your, one hopes, democratically elected successor government with absolute economic devastation to have to, you know, resurrect, that's not a good starting point. So, yeah, basically, I don't believe in these boycott campaigns. I think, you know, there's no harm in getting banks and others to pay far more attention, particularly banks in the region, to pay far more attention to transactions that they're doing. Not at all. I agree with that. But to campaign for Maersk to leave, I just don't get it, you know, as somebody, and nor do people, frankly, inside the country. I think these things are often drawn from a sort of feeling of, you know, helplessness and something must be done, rather than actually thinking through what are going to be the consequences, both short-term and long-term here.
Thanks, Vicky. We have Jihan.
Thank you so much. Jihan, and I'm from Malaysia. So Malaysia has a large population of displaced Rohingya in our community. So do you think that the framework of remedies should go beyond the borders of the conflict itself, and how? Thank you.
I mean, that, to me, is about remedy vis-a-vis the actions of a government. You know, I think the Rohingya crisis and what's driven the exodus has not been business-driven at all. So it's a bit beyond these subjects. And obviously, you know, there are multiple international court cases, and there's been sort of looking at whether or not I mean, I think it was even a legal opinion about whether or not a case could be taken in or by Malaysia. But for me, these are not business and human rights questions, to be honest. But they're very valid questions nonetheless.
Fantastic. Any more? Oh, go ahead.
Vicky, I wanted to ask in relation to if a business is directly linked to a human rights impact in their supply chain, for example, and the advice is they use their leverage, and if it's not working, then terminate a relationship. In relation to responsible exit from a country that might be in conflict, I'm also then curious about your views about a company terminating its relationship, because then those workers are left with no recourse remedy.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally the exit of the more responsible businesses either leads to, you know, just a net loss of jobs, because I mean, often the company is leaving because they're making a loss, and nobody will pick up that factory or whatever. Net job loss. Impacts on the women workers. If we're talking for garment sector, their options are, you know, sex work. Used to be going back to their villages to work in agriculture. Now that's less and less an option. Migrant labour we're now seeing Myanmar workers turning up in Laos and Cambodia. But the business that's exited, you know, they've long gone away from that, and there's no remedy for those workers from their previous employer. Or it's a profitable business, and it will be picked up by a lower quality player who will fill the gap. And that's what we saw, for example, when Telenor left, because, you know, other responsible telecoms companies were like, no, Myanmar, we're not going to touch that. Now, I was involved in a kind of Telenor sort of lessons learned exercise, one of the lessons of which was that if you go into a challenging context, you should, a bit like a sort of, you know, a safety preparation, check the fire exits first and think about how you're going to leave it. And one option that we heard from people who'd been involved with Telenor in country was it would have been nice to have created a kind of lifeboat Telenor that wasn't obviously the Norwegian corporate, which had to leave because of their sanctions obligations, but was still a company that continued Telenor's DNA. Telenor, I think, in exiting was trying to do that, but did it with a Lebanese private equity partner. I mean, there's all sorts of complications and an ongoing national contact point. But there might have been other ways to plan for exit that could have been kicked into place had people thought about it at the time. But as I mentioned at the beginning, everybody was in a very sort of positive, buzzy mood. And I don't think many people actually even foresaw the coup, let alone were thinking back in 2013 that was going to happen. So yeah, thinking ahead for all the bad things that might happen obviously often is not a very kind of top of mind thing for one's board of directors, but it is probably good practice. There's this concept of doing a pre-mortem, where before you do something, you assume it's already dead and work out all the things that might have killed it. And then how could you have prevented that from happening in the first place? That kind of thing, I think, is quite good intellectual and to some extent practical practice.
Okay, and I'll just use that as an opportunity to plug our guide, because that's exactly what we recommend in the Guide on Heightened Human Rights Due Diligence. So with that, we've gone 12 minutes over time. So I'd like to thank Vicky for the great conversation we had, all of you for your attention and questions. And thanks very much. We'll be seeing you around. Thank you.
Thank you.